Sarah Martinez had always found peace in the early morning hours at the shooting range. The sun barely peeked over the horizon as she unlocked the heavy metal doors of Desert Eagle Range, located 30 miles outside of Phoenix, Arizona. At 28, she had been managing this remote facility for 3 years, and the solitude never bothered her. In fact, she preferred it this way. The range sat in a valley surrounded by rocky hills and sparse desert vegetation. It was the perfect location for military training exercises, which made up most of their business. Sarah had grown up around firearms thanks to her father, who was a retired Marine. She could field strip an M4 rifle blindfolded and knew the difference between various ammunition types just by their sound when fired. This particular Tuesday morning started like any other. Sarah made her rounds, checking the target systems, ensuring the backstops were clear, and testing the communication equipment. The range had 12 lanes for rifle practice and a separate area for tactical training. Everything appeared normal as she prepared for the day's first clients. At exactly 0700 hours, 3 black SUVs pulled into the gravel parking area. Sarah watched through the office window as 8 men in civilian clothes stepped out. She immediately recognized the bearing of military personnel, even without uniforms. Their movements were precise, coordinated, and purposeful. The way they scanned their surroundings and positioned themselves told her these weren't ordinary shooters. The team leader approached the office, a tall man with dark hair and intense green eyes. He introduced himself simply as Commander Torres and explained they needed the range for specialized training. Sarah had handled many military contracts before, so she began the standard paperwork process. What she didn't know was that this was SEAL Team 6, conducting classified training for an upcoming mission in hostile territory. Torres handed her a thick envelope containing payment and specific instructions. The training would last 4 days, and during that time the range would be exclusively theirs. No other clients, no interruptions, and complete privacy. Sarah nodded, having dealt with similar requests from special operations units before. The money was good, and these professionals always left the facility in better condition than they found it. As the morning progressed, Sarah observed the team's training routine. They moved with incredible precision, transitioning between different weapon systems and practicing complex scenarios. She noticed one SEAL in particular, a sniper who worked with an advanced rifle system she had never seen before. He was methodical in his approach, taking detailed notes and making minute adjustments to his equipment. The sniper's name was Chief Petty Officer Jake Sullivan, though Sarah only knew him as Sully. He had been with the teams for 12 years and was considered one of the best marksmen in the Navy. His rifle was a custom-built system worth more than most people's cars, equipped with advanced optics and specialized ammunition. Every shot he took was calculated and precise, hitting targets at distances that seemed impossible. During the lunch break, Sully approached Sarah at the office. He was curious about her background, impressed by how efficiently she managed the range and her obvious knowledge of firearms. Sarah learned that he grew up in rural Montana, where his grandfather taught him to hunt and shoot. Their conversation revealed a shared respect for marksmanship and the responsibility that came with handling weapons. As the afternoon training session began, Sarah noticed increased radio chatter among the team members. They seemed more focused, more intense than earlier in the day. Torres received several encrypted communications, and the team's demeanor shifted noticeably. What had started as routine training was beginning to feel more urgent. Sarah remained in the office, monitoring the range's security cameras and maintaining communication with the tower. The facility had multiple surveillance systems, including thermal imaging and motion detectors around the perimeter. It was overkill for a civilian shooting range, but the military contracts justified the investment in security equipment. Around 1500 hours, Sully took a break from his long-range shooting practice. He walked over to Sarah's position and asked about the range's defensive capabilities. The question struck her as odd, but she explained the security measures without thinking much of it. The range was isolated, which made it secure but also potentially vulnerable if something went wrong. As evening approached, the team began packing their equipment. However, instead of leaving, they established what appeared to be a temporary command post in the main building. Sarah realized this wasn't just training anymore. The SEALs were preparing for something real, something immediate. The pieces of radio conversations she overheard mentioned time-sensitive intelligence and a narrow window of opportunity. Torres pulled Sarah aside and explained that circumstances had changed. They needed to use the range as a staging area for an operation that would begin before dawn. He assured her that she would be compensated for the inconvenience and that additional security measures were being put in place. Sarah agreed, though she was beginning to feel uneasy about the situation. As darkness fell, the atmosphere at the range became increasingly tense. The SEALs worked with quiet efficiency, checking equipment and reviewing plans. Sarah noticed they had communication equipment she had never seen before, and there were frequent encrypted calls to an unknown command structure. The isolation that usually comforted her now felt ominous. Sully spent considerable time preparing his rifle system, cleaning every component and testing the optics repeatedly. Sarah watched from a distance as he loaded specialized ammunition and made final adjustments to his scope. The precision of his preparation was mesmerizing, but also concerning. This level of detail suggested they were preparing for something extremely important and dangerous. By 2200 hours, the range had been transformed into a miniature forward operating base. The SEALs had established perimeter security, set up communication arrays, and positioned their vehicles strategically. Sarah found herself in the middle of something far beyond her normal experience managing a shooting range. Torres approached her once more before she planned to leave for the night. He explained that due to operational security requirements, she would need to remain at the facility until the mission was completed. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she realized she was no longer just a range manager. She was now part of whatever was about to happen. The night sky was clear, filled with stars that seemed brighter in the desert darkness. Sarah sat in the office watching the SEALs make their final preparations. She had no idea that within hours her life would change forever, and she would be tested in ways she never imagined possible. The routine Tuesday that had started so peacefully was about to become anything but ordinary. At 300 hours, Sarah was awakened by the sound of helicopter rotors in the distance. She had managed only a few hours of restless sleep on the office couch, her mind racing with questions about what was happening at her range. Through the window, she could see the SEALs moving with renewed urgency, their night vision equipment glowing green in the darkness. Torres entered the office, his expression grim. He carried a steaming cup of coffee and sat down across from Sarah's makeshift bed. The situation had escalated, he explained, and they needed her help in ways she couldn't have anticipated. Intelligence sources had identified a high-value target in a compound approximately 40 miles southeast of their location. The target was planning an imminent attack on American civilians, and this was their only opportunity to stop it. Sarah listened as Torres explained that the compound was heavily fortified and surrounded by hostile territory. The mission required precise coordination between multiple teams, advanced surveillance, and expert marksmanship. What made the situation more complicated was that the target would only be vulnerable for a narrow window of time, and they needed every advantage possible to ensure mission success. The helicopter that had awakened Sarah landed in the desert behind the range, carrying additional equipment and personnel. Among the new arrivals was Lieutenant Commander Rachel Hayes, an intelligence officer who would coordinate the mission from their temporary command post. Hayes had been tracking this particular target for months, and this was their best chance to eliminate the threat before innocent people were killed. As dawn approached, Sarah found herself drawn into the mission briefing. Her knowledge of the local terrain and the range's equipment made her unexpectedly valuable to the operation. The shooting range sat on elevated ground with clear sightlines to the target area, making it an ideal observation and support position. What had been a simple business transaction was becoming a critical component of a life-or-death mission. Sully had spent the night preparing for what would be the most important shot of his career. The distance to the target was at the extreme edge of his rifle's capability, requiring perfect conditions and flawless execution. He had calculated wind patterns, atmospheric pressure, and even the rotation of the Earth to ensure his shot would be accurate. Sarah watched him work, amazed by the level of precision required for such long-range shooting. The intelligence Hayes shared was disturbing. The target, known only as Phoenix, was a former military officer who had turned to terrorism after becoming radicalized overseas. He had assembled a team of experienced fighters and was planning to attack a shopping center during peak hours. The attack was scheduled for that afternoon, giving the SEALs only hours to prevent a massacre. Sarah's range was positioned perfectly to provide overwatch for the compound where Phoenix was hiding. The elevated position and clear sight lines made it an ideal sniper's nest. However, using the range for this purpose would put Sarah directly in harm's way. Torres gave her the option to leave, but she surprised herself by choosing to stay. Something about the mission's importance and the professionalism of the SEALs made her want to help however she could. As the sun rose over the desert, the true scope of the operation became clear. Multiple teams were positioned around the target area, each with specific roles in the coordinated assault. Sarah's range would serve as both a command post and a sniper position, with Sully providing precision fire support from the longest range shooting lane. Hayes set up her command equipment in the range's main building, transforming it into a high-tech communications hub. Satellite feeds, radio networks, and encrypted communication systems created a constant flow of information about the target and surrounding area. Sarah found herself helping with tasks she never imagined, from monitoring surveillance feeds to assisting with equipment setup. The target compound was a fortified ranch house surrounded by open desert. Phoenix and his team had chosen the location specifically because it was isolated and easily defended. What they hadn't anticipated was that this isolation would also make them vulnerable to long-range surveillance and precision attacks. The SEALs had turned the terrorists' strength into a weakness. Sully explained to Sarah how the shot would work. He would fire from the range's 1,200-yard lane, but the actual target was much farther away. Using the range's elevated position and specialized ammunition, he could effectively engage targets at distances exceeding 2,000 yards. The margin for error was incredibly small, requiring perfect environmental conditions and split-second timing. As morning progressed, reconnaissance teams provided detailed intelligence about the compound's layout and the number of hostiles present. Phoenix had 6 men with him, all armed and dangerous. The compound had multiple defensive positions and clear fields of fire in all directions except one, the direction of Sarah's range, which was too far away to be considered a threat by conventional thinking. Sarah learned that the attack on civilians was planned for 1400 hours, when the shopping center would be most crowded. Phoenix's team had weapons and explosives sufficient to cause massive casualties. The window for stopping them was closing rapidly, and weather conditions were becoming less favorable for long-range shooting as desert winds began to pick up. Hayes received confirmation that all teams were in position and ready to execute the mission. The plan was complex but straightforward. Simultaneous assault from multiple directions while Sully provided precision elimination of high-value targets from long range. Sarah's range had become the anchor point for an operation that would save dozens of innocent lives. The weight of responsibility was overwhelming. Sarah had always been comfortable with firearms, but she had never been involved in anything like this. These weren't paper targets or clay pigeons. Real lives hung in the balance, and she was now part of the team trying to protect them. The routine morning that had started so normally had evolved into something she could never have imagined. Sully made final adjustments to his rifle, checking every component one last time. The weapon was a work of art, engineered for precisely this type of mission. Sarah watched him work, noting the calm concentration in his movements. There was no hurry, no wasted motion, just the methodical preparation of a professional who understood that lives depended on his accuracy. As the clock approached noon, tension filled the air at the range. Multiple teams reported ready status, surveillance confirmed target locations, and weather conditions were holding steady. Everything was in place for an operation that would either save innocent lives or result in tragedy if something went wrong. Torres approached Sarah one final time before the mission began. He thanked her for her help and reminded her that what she was witnessing was classified at the highest levels. More importantly, he wanted her to understand that her contribution was making the difference between success and failure. The range she had built for sport shooting was about to become the platform for saving lives. At exactly 12:30 hours, everything changed in an instant. Sarah was monitoring the communications equipment when Hayes suddenly stiffened at her station. Multiple surveillance systems were detecting movement around the compound, but not in the way they had expected. Instead of preparing to leave for their planned attack, Phoenix's team was taking defensive positions and scanning the horizon with binoculars and spotting scopes. "They know we're here," Hayes announced grimly, her voice cutting through the tense atmosphere. Somehow, despite all their operational security measures, the terrorists had detected the SEAL team's presence. Whether through electronic surveillance, human intelligence, or simple paranoia, Phoenix had realized he was being watched and was adapting accordingly. Torres immediately began coordinating with the other teams through encrypted communications. The mission parameters had suddenly shifted from a surprise assault to a potential siege situation. Phoenix's team was no longer planning to leave for their attack on civilians. They were preparing to fight from their fortified position. This changed everything about the tactical approach and timeline. Sully remained calm at his shooting position, making minute adjustments to account for the changing wind conditions. His role had just become even more critical. If the terrorists couldn't be taken by surprise, precision elimination of key targets would be essential to prevent them from escaping or, worse, detonating explosives that intelligence suggested they had stockpiled in the compound. Sarah watched the situation unfold through multiple camera feeds and radio communications. The compound erupted with activity as Phoenix's men moved to defensive positions. They had heavy weapons, including what appeared to be a mounted machine gun and rocket-propelled grenades. The isolated ranch house had been turned into a fortress, and the SEALs were now facing a much more dangerous situation than originally planned. Hayes received an urgent communication from higher command. Intelligence sources had intercepted communications indicating that Phoenix had a backup plan. If his primary attack on the shopping center was compromised, he would detonate explosives at the compound itself. The explosion would not only kill his own team, but would also eliminate evidence of a much larger terrorist network that investigators desperately needed to uncover. The stakes had suddenly escalated beyond saving civilian lives at a shopping center. The mission now involved preventing the destruction of critical intelligence that could lead to other terrorist cells across the country. Phoenix couldn't be allowed to die in a way that would destroy the information he possessed about his network's plans and membership. Sully studied the compound through his high-powered scope, identifying targets and calculating shooting solutions. The distance was extreme, pushing the limits of both his equipment and his considerable skills. Environmental conditions were deteriorating as desert winds picked up, making accurate shooting increasingly difficult. Every minute that passed made his job more challenging. At 12:45 hours, the first shots were fired, but not by the SEALs. Phoenix's team had spotted one of the reconnaissance units and opened fire with automatic weapons. The sharp crack of rifle fire echoed across the desert, followed by the heavier reports of machine guns. The mission had officially begun, though not according to plan. Sarah found herself in the middle of a real firefight for the first time in her life. The sounds of combat were different from anything she had experienced at the range. These weren't controlled shots at paper targets. These were weapons fired in anger with lethal intent. The intensity was overwhelming, but she forced herself to focus on helping however she could. Torres coordinated the response from the range's command post, directing teams to adjust their positions and calling for air support. However, the nearest military aircraft were over an hour away, and Phoenix's team was already demonstrating they were willing to fight to the death. The SEALs would have to handle this situation with the resources they had on hand. The terrorists' position was stronger than anticipated. They had prepared the compound for exactly this type of assault, with overlapping fields of fire and prepared defensive positions. What should have been a quick surgical strike was turning into a protracted battle against well-armed and determined opponents who had the advantage of defensive terrain. Sully's voice came through the radio, calm and professional despite the chaos around him. He had identified Phoenix through his scope and was requesting permission to engage. However, the extreme range and deteriorating conditions made the shot extremely difficult. A miss could alert the target to the sniper's position and potentially result in Phoenix's escape or the detonation of explosives. Hayes was coordinating with intelligence analysts who were frantically trying to determine how Phoenix had detected their presence. The implications were serious. If there was a security breach in the operation, other missions could be compromised. More immediately, they needed to understand what other surprises Phoenix might have prepared for them. The firefight intensified as more SEAL teams moved into position. Phoenix's team was well-trained and disciplined, using fire and movement tactics that indicated military backgrounds. They weren't ordinary criminals or amateur terrorists. These were experienced fighters who understood combat. tactics and weren't going to surrender easily. Sarah realized that her peaceful shooting range had become the nerve center for a battle that could determine whether innocent people lived or died. The responsibility was staggering, but she found herself rising to the challenge. Her knowledge of the facility's capabilities and the local terrain was proving invaluable to the mission commanders. At 1300 hours, Hayes received devastating news. Intelligence had intercepted communications indicating that Phoenix had moved up his timeline. If his compound was overrun, he would detonate explosives at 1400 hours, the same time his team was supposed to attack the shopping center. This meant the SEALs had less than an hour to neutralize the threat without triggering a catastrophic explosion. The pressure on Sully was enormous. His shot had to be perfect at an extreme range and deteriorating conditions with no room for error. Sarah watched him prepare, noting the complete concentration in his movements. Everything depended on one man's ability to place a single bullet exactly where it needed to go. At a distance most people couldn't even see clearly. Torres made the decision to accelerate the assault. All teams would move simultaneously, with Sully providing covering fire to eliminate key targets. The coordination required was incredible. Multiple teams attacking from different directions, while avoiding friendly fire and preventing Phoenix from triggering his explosives. Sarah's role expanded beyond simply providing facility support. Hayes needed someone to monitor multiple communication channels while she coordinated with field teams. Sarah found herself relaying critical information between units, helping to maintain the complex coordination required for the assault. Her civilian status had become irrelevant. She was now part of the team. The sound of helicopter rotors began to build in the distance. Air support was finally approaching, but it might not arrive in time to make a difference. The battle would likely be decided in the next few minutes by the actions of the SEAL teams on the ground and Sully's ability to make an impossible shot under the worst possible conditions. As the clock ticked toward 1330 hours, Sarah realized that her quiet Tuesday managing a shooting range had transformed into the most important day of her life. Lives hung in the balance, and she was no longer just an observer. She was part of a team fighting to prevent a tragedy, and failure was not an option. At 1330 hours, the situation reached a critical point that would determine the outcome of everything. Sully had Phoenix in his crosshairs, but the shot was at the absolute limit of what was possible. The wind had picked up significantly, creating unpredictable air currents across the 2,000-yard distance. Environmental conditions were deteriorating by the minute, and they were running out of time. Sarah watched through the spotting scope as Sully made microscopic adjustments to his rifle. His breathing was controlled and methodical, each movement calculated to compensate for the challenging conditions. The pressure was immense, one shot to save innocent lives and prevent a massive explosion that would destroy critical intelligence about terrorist networks. Hayes received another urgent communication that made the situation even more desperate. Intelligence analysts had discovered that Phoenix wasn't just planning one attack. The shopping center bombing was meant to be the first in a series of coordinated strikes across multiple cities. The information stored in his compound was the key to preventing attacks that could kill hundreds of people over the coming weeks. Torres coordinated the final assault positions while maintaining constant communication with Sully. Sniper's shot had to be timed perfectly with the ground assault to prevent Phoenix from triggering the explosives. If Sully missed or if the timing was off by even seconds, the entire mission could end in catastrophe. The margin for error had essentially disappeared. The sound of automatic weapons fire echoed across the desert as SEAL teams engaged Phoenix's outer security perimeter. The terrorists were fighting desperately, knowing they were trapped but determined to complete their mission even if it meant dying in the process. The intensity of the firefight was unlike anything Sarah had ever witnessed. Even in movies or television, Sully's voice came through the radio with professional calm that belied the enormous pressure he was facing. He had Phoenix centered in his scope, but the target kept moving between covered positions. The terrorist leader was paranoid and experienced, rarely exposing himself for more than a few seconds at a time. When he did appear, it was often partially concealed behind cover. Sarah found herself holding her breath as she watched Sully prepare for the shot. Through the spotting scope, she could see the compound clearly despite the distance. Phoenix appeared briefly at a window, scanning the approaching SEAL teams with binoculars. This might be the only clear shot they would get, but the wind was gusting unpredictably, making accurate shooting nearly impossible. Hayes was coordinating with the assault teams while simultaneously monitoring intelligence feeds that showed the broader implications of the mission. Other terrorist cells were watching the outcome of this operation. If Phoenix succeeded in detonating his explosives and destroying the intelligence, it would signal to other groups that they could operate with impunity. The stakes extended far beyond this single engagement. At 13:35 hours, disaster struck from an unexpected direction. One of Phoenix's sentries spotted the reflection from Sully's scope and opened fire with a heavy machine gun. Bullets began impacting around the shooting position, forcing Sully to take cover and disrupting his careful preparation. The sniper's position had been compromised at the worst possible moment. Sarah reacted instinctively, grabbing smoke grenades from the SEAL's equipment and deploying them around Sully's position. The thick white smoke provided concealment from the machine gunner, but also made it nearly impossible for Sully to see his target. The solution to one problem had created another equally serious challenge. Torres made a desperate decision to accelerate the ground assault, hoping to distract Phoenix's team and give Sully another opportunity. All teams moved simultaneously, advancing under heavy fire toward the compound. The sound of combat was deafening, automatic weapons, explosions, and radio communications creating a cacophony of war in the desert. Sully repositioned to an alternate shooting lane, but the new angle made the shot even more difficult. The range and wind conditions were worse from this position, and he had less time to calculate the complex ballistics required for such an extreme long-range shot. Sarah helped him move his equipment, marveling at the weight and complexity of the advanced sniper system. Hayes received intelligence that Phoenix was preparing to detonate the explosives early. Intercepted communications indicated he realized the compound was about to be overrun and was moving toward the detonation device. The window of opportunity was closing rapidly, measured now in minutes rather than hours. If they couldn't stop him immediately, hundreds of innocent people would die. Through the spotting scope, Sarah saw Phoenix moving between rooms in the compound, clearly heading toward what intelligence believed was the explosive storage area. The terrorist leader was methodical even under extreme pressure, checking defensive positions and coordinating his fighters' resistance. He was a dangerous opponent who wouldn't be easily stopped. Sully had found a shooting position that gave him a narrow window into the compound's main room. It wasn't ideal, but it was the only angle that might work. He began his final preparations, calculating wind speed, atmospheric pressure, and target movement patterns. The shot would require perfect timing and a significant amount of luck to succeed. At 13:40 hours, the assault teams reached the compound's outer perimeter. Explosive charges breached the defensive walls, and SEALs poured through the gaps under intense fire. The close-quarters battle was fierce, with Phoenix's team fighting room by room to slow the advance. Every second of delay brought them closer to the detonation deadline. Sarah monitored multiple radio channels, relaying critical information between teams and helping Hayes coordinate the complex operation. She had become an integral part of the mission command structure, her civilian background forgotten in the intensity of the moment. The range manager had transformed into a vital member of a life-or-death operation. Sully's breathing slowed as he prepared for the most important shot of his career. Through his scope, he could see Phoenix moving toward the back of the compound where intelligence believed the explosives were stored. The terrorist leader was almost within range of the detonation device, and this might be the last clear opportunity to stop him. The wind conditions had stabilized slightly, giving Sully a brief window of opportunity. He calculated the complex ballistics required for the shot, accounting for distance, wind drift, bullet drop, and target movement. The mathematics were staggering, but his years of training and experience had prepared him for exactly this type of challenge. Hayes counted down the seconds until the estimated detonation time, her voice tense but controlled. The assault teams were still fighting through the compound's defenses, but they might not reach Phoenix in time. Everything depended on Sully's ability to make an impossible shot under the worst possible conditions. The fate of hundreds of innocent people rested on one man's skill and courage. Sarah watched through the spotting scope as Phoenix appeared in the compound's main room, moving purposefully toward the rear of the building. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The terrorist leader was exposed and moving predictably. Sully had his shot, but the conditions were still extremely challenging. The next few seconds would determine whether the mission succeeded or failed catastrophically. At 13:42 hours, Sully steadied his breathing and began the final sequence for what would be remembered as one of the most difficult shots in military history. Phoenix was visible through a narrow window in the compound's main room, moving steadily toward what intelligence had identified as the explosive storage area. The terrorist leader was less than 30 seconds away from the detonation device. Sarah held the spotting scope steady, calling out wind conditions and target movement to help Sully calculate the shot. The distance was 2,247 yards according to the laser rangefinder, nearly 1.25 miles. At that range, the bullet would take almost 3 seconds to reach the target, during which time Phoenix could move several feet in any direction. The mathematical precision required was staggering. Through her scope, Sarah could see that Phoenix was wounded from the firefight but still moving with purpose. Blood stained his left shoulder, but his right arm was functional, and that was all he needed to trigger the explosives. The terrorist leader knew he was about to die, but he was determined to complete his mission and take as many enemies with him as possible. Sully made microscopic adjustments to his scope, compensating for the crosswind that had been plaguing the shot attempt. The wind was coming from the northwest at approximately 12 miles per hour, but it was gusting unpredictably. At extreme range, even a slight miscalculation would cause the bullet to miss by several feet. There would be no second chance. Hayes monitored the assault team's progress through encrypted communications. They had reached the compound's main building but were encountering fierce resistance in the interior rooms. Phoenix's remaining fighters were making a last stand, using prepared defensive positions and improvised explosives to slow the SEAL advance. They were buying their leader precious time to reach the detonation device. The pressure on Sully was beyond anything most people could imagine. He had made difficult shots before, but never with so many lives hanging in the balance and under such challenging conditions. The desert wind continued to gust unpredictably, and the late afternoon sun was creating heat mirages that distorted the view through his scope. Every environmental factor was working against him. Sarah called out Phoenix's movement pattern, noting that the terrorist leader was following a predictable path toward the rear of the room. This gave Sully a crucial advantage. He could anticipate where the target would be when the bullet arrived. The calculation required him to aim not at where Phoenix was, but where he would be in 3 seconds. It was like shooting at a ghost. At 13:43 hours, Torres received confirmation that the assault teams were still 30 seconds away from Phoenix's position. The terrorist leader had barricaded the final room and was using automatic weapons to keep the SEALs at bay. Even if they breached his defenses immediately, he would still have time to trigger the explosives. Sully's shot was no longer just important. It was the only way to prevent catastrophe. Through the spotting scope, Sarah watched Phoenix disappear momentarily behind a support beam, then reappear moving steadily toward the back wall. Her heart pounded as she realized this might be Sully's last clear opportunity. The terrorist leader was almost at the detonation device, and once he reached it, the game would be over for everyone. Sully's finger moved to the trigger as he completed his final calculations. Wind speed, atmospheric pressure, target movement, bullet drop, earth rotation. Dozens of variables had to be considered simultaneously. The shot required not just marksmanship skills but an understanding of physics that few people possessed. Everything he had learned in 12 years of military service came down to this single moment. Hayes counted down the seconds until estimated detonation. Her voice barely controlled despite her professional training. Intelligence intercepts suggested Phoenix had set a backup timer for 13:45 hours, giving him time to escape if the manual detonation failed. That left less than 2 minutes to stop him, and the assault teams were still fighting through determined resistance. The wind suddenly calmed for a few seconds, giving Sully a brief window of optimal shooting conditions. Through his scope, he could see Phoenix clearly as the terrorist leader reached for what appeared to be the detonation device. This was the moment, now or never. Sully's training took over, and his finger began the smooth, steady squeeze that would send a specially designed bullet across more than 2,000 yards of desert. Sarah held her breath as she watched through the spotting scope. Phoenix had paused at the detonation device, looking back toward the sounds of the approaching assault teams. For just a moment, he was perfectly still, presenting the clearest target Sully had seen all day. The terrorist leader's arrogance in that final moment gave the sniper the opportunity he needed. The rifle fired with a sharp crack that echoed across the desert. Sarah tracked the bullet's path through her scope, though at that distance the projectile was invisible to the naked eye. The specialized round Sully was using was designed for extreme long-range accuracy, with a boat-tail design and carefully balanced weight distribution that maintained stability even in difficult wind conditions. For what seemed like an eternity, nothing happened. The bullet was in flight, traveling at over 2,800 feet per second across the vast distance to the target. Sarah counted the seconds: 1,001, 1,002, 1,003. At that moment, she saw Phoenix suddenly jerk and fall backward, the detonation device flying from his hand to clatter harmlessly across the floor. The compound erupted in cheers from the assault teams as they realized Phoenix was down. Through the radio communications, Sarah could hear the SEALs securing the explosives and ensuring the terrorist leader was no longer a threat. The immediate danger was over, but the implications of what had just happened were still sinking in. Sully remained motionless at his rifle, continuing to observe the target area through his scope. His training demanded that he maintain overwatch until the situation was completely secure. Despite having made one of the most remarkable shots in military history, his expression showed only professional satisfaction at a job well done. The celebration would come later. Hayes was already coordinating with intelligence teams to secure the information stored in Phoenix's compound. The terrorist leader's death had prevented the immediate detonation, but the real victory would come from analyzing his communications and plans to prevent future attacks. The network Phoenix had built was still out there, and this operation had only eliminated one component of a larger threat. Torres approached Sully's position with a mixture of awe and relief. The shot would be analyzed and discussed by ballistics experts for years to come. At 2,247 yards in difficult wind conditions, it represented the outer limits of what was possible with current technology and human skill. More importantly, it had saved countless innocent lives. Sarah realized she had just witnessed something extraordinary. The precise application of skill, technology, and courage had prevented a tragedy that could have changed many families forever. Her shooting range, built for sport and recreation, had become the platform for one of the most important shots ever fired. The responsibility and privilege of that moment would stay with her for the rest of her life. The immediate celebration was short-lived. At 13:47 hours, just minutes after Sully's successful shot, Hayes received an urgent communication that drained the color from her face. Intelligence analyst monitoring terrorist communications had intercepted a disturbing message. Phoenix's death had triggered an automatic alert to his network, and a secondary team was already moving toward the shopping center to complete the original mission. Sarah watched the mood in the command post shift dramatically from relief to renewed urgency. The successful elimination of Phoenix had solved one problem, but revealed another equally dangerous threat. The terrorist network was more sophisticated than anyone had realized, with multiple layers of backup plans and autonomous cells capable of operating independently. Torres immediately began coordinating with local law enforcement and federal agencies to secure the shopping center. However, the secondary team had a significant head start, and their exact location was unknown. The intelligence suggested they were already in position and could execute their attack at any moment. The race against time had begun again, but now the enemy had the advantage. Sully remained at his rifle, scanning the compound area for any additional threats. The assault teams had secured Phoenix's body and were beginning to process the intelligence materials found in the building. However, the sniper's job wasn't finished. Intelligence suggested there might be additional terrorist operatives in the area, and his overwatch position was still crucial for the teams on the ground. Hayes was frantically coordinating with multiple agencies, trying to piece together information about the secondary team's composition and capabilities. The intercepted communications were fragmented and heavily coded, making it difficult to determine exactly what they were facing. What was clear was that Phoenix had planned for the possibility of his own death and had contingencies in place. Sarah found herself once again at the center of a rapidly evolving crisis. Her range was still serving as the command post for what had become a multifaceted operation. The original mission was complete, but the broader threat was still active. She realized that her involvement in this situation was far from over, and the danger was escalating rather than diminishing. At 13:55 hours, a new crisis emerged that no one had anticipated. Motion sensors around the range perimeter began detecting multiple contacts approaching from different directions. The thermal imaging system showed at least 6 individuals moving through the desert terrain, clearly attempting to surround the facility. Phoenix's backup plan included an assault on the command post itself. Torres immediately ordered defensive positions as the SEALs prepared for an attack on their own location. The irony was stark. They had successfully eliminated the primary threat only to discover that they had become targets themselves. The terrorist network's planning was more comprehensive than anyone had imagined, with contingencies that extended beyond the original mission parameters. Sarah's peaceful shooting range was about to become a battlefield for the second time in one day. The facility's defensive capabilities, which had seemed like overkill for a civilian operation, suddenly became crucial for survival. The security systems she had installed for military training contracts were now the only thing standing between the command team and a coordinated terrorist assault. Sully repositioned his rifle to cover the most likely approach routes, but his advanced sniper system wasn't designed for close-range defensive operations. The attacking force was too close and moving too quickly for effective long-range engagement. He would need to adapt his tactics and equipment to deal with this new threat. Hayes continued coordinating with external agencies while simultaneously managing the immediate security crisis. The command post contained sensitive equipment and classified information that couldn't be allowed to fall into enemy hands. If the facility was overrun, the intelligence value to terrorist networks would be enormous, potentially compromising future operations across the country. The attacking force moved with military precision, using fire and movement tactics that indicated professional training. These weren't amateur terrorists or local criminals. They were experienced fighters who understood small unit tactics and coordinated assault procedures. Phoenix had recruited the best people available for his network, and they were demonstrating their capabilities. Sarah helped the SEALs prepare the range's defensive positions, using her knowledge of the facility's layout to maximum advantage. The building had been designed with security in mind, but it wasn't a fortress. The defensive preparations would help, but they were still outnumbered and facing an enemy that had chosen the time and place of the engagement. At 1400 hours, the first shots were fired at the range itself. High-velocity rifle rounds began impacting the building's exterior, followed by the distinctive sound of automatic weapons. The terrorists were using suppressive fire to cover their advance, demonstrating tactical sophistication that exceeded initial intelligence estimates about their capabilities. Torres coordinated the defense while maintaining communication, with the team still processing intelligence at Phoenix's compound. The SEALs were now fighting on 2 fronts, securing the terrorist leader's intelligence while defending their own command post. The complexity of the situation was testing every aspect of their training and equipment. Sully's voice came through the radio with urgent clarity. Through his scope, he had identified what appeared to be the assault team's leader, a woman with distinctive tactical gear who was coordinating the attack. The distance was much shorter than his previous shot, but the target was moving rapidly and using cover effectively. It would still require precision shooting under combat conditions. Sarah realized that her rifle range had become the center of a much larger conflict than she had ever imagined. The terrorists weren't just attacking the facility. They were attempting to rescue intelligence materials and eliminate witnesses to their network's activities. The stakes had escalated beyond preventing an attack on civilians to protecting national security information. Hayes received another urgent communication that added a new dimension to the crisis. The secondary team at the shopping center had been located by federal agents, but they were heavily armed and had taken hostages. The situation was rapidly spiraling into a multi-location crisis that was stretching law enforcement and military resources to their limits. The sound of explosions echoed across the desert as the attacking terrorists used grenades to breach the range's outer defensive perimeter. The facility's security systems were being systematically defeated by opponents who clearly understood their capabilities and limitations. Sarah watched her peaceful business being transformed into a war zone for the second time in a single day. Sully prepared for another critical shot, but this time the target was much closer and the stakes were more personal. The attacking force was threatening not just the mission, but the lives of everyone in the command post. His rifle had become the primary defensive weapon for a facility that was never designed to withstand a military assault. As the attack intensified, Sarah found herself facing a choice she never expected to make. The SEALs were outnumbered and fighting on multiple fronts. Her knowledge of the facility and her shooting skills, developed over years of managing the range, might be the difference between survival and catastrophe. The civilian had become a combatant whether she wanted to or not. At 14:05 hours, with explosions echoing around the range and bullets impacting the building, Sully made a decision that would change Sarah's life forever. The terrorist assault was intensifying, and the SEALs were running low on ammunition after the prolonged firefight. Torres was coordinating defensive positions, but they needed every available shooter to hold their ground until reinforcements arrived. Sully turned to Sarah with an intensity she had never seen before. His advanced sniper rifle system represented months of training and years of experience, but the situation demanded desperate measures. Without hesitation, he began explaining the weapon's operation, knowing that her shooting background and knowledge of the range's layout made her their best option for additional defensive fire. Sarah's hands trembled as she accepted the rifle. That was worth more than her annual salary. The weapon was heavier and more complex than anything she had ever handled, with advanced optics and precision adjustments that required expert knowledge to operate effectively. But Sully's quick instruction and her own shooting experience gave her confidence that she could contribute to their survival. The rifle's scope revealed details of the attacking force that were invisible to the naked eye. Sarah could see individual terrorists moving through the desert terrain, using rock formations and sparse vegetation for cover as they advanced on the range. Their movements were coordinated and professional, confirming that these were experienced fighters rather than amateur criminals. Hayes continued managing communications with multiple agencies while taking cover from the incoming fire. The situation at the shopping center remained critical, with federal agents still trying to resolve the hostage situation. Meanwhile, reinforcements for the range were at least 20 minutes away, and the defending SEALs might not be able to hold their positions that long without additional support. Sarah's first shot with Sully's rifle was at a terrorist who had exposed himself while attempting to place an explosive charge on the range's main entrance. The distance was only 300 yards, much shorter than Sully's earlier shot, but the adrenaline and pressure made it feel impossibly difficult. She controlled her breathing and squeezed the trigger smoothly, just as her father had taught her years ago. The shot found its target, and the terrorist dropped the explosive device before falling behind cover. Sarah felt a mixture of shock and satisfaction. She had never shot at a human being before, but the threat to innocent lives made the decision clear. The advanced rifle made precision shooting possible even under the stress of combat conditions. Sully provided guidance and encouragement while engaging targets with his sidearm from a different position. His willingness to trust Sarah with his primary weapon demonstrated a level of confidence that meant everything to her. The civilian shooting instructor had become a vital part of a military operation that could determine whether they all survived the next hour. Torres coordinated defensive fires while monitoring the broader tactical situation. The terrorists were advancing methodically, using suppressive fire and coordinated movement to close the distance to the main building. Their tactics indicated military training and suggested they were following a rehearsed plan for assaulting the facility. Sarah's next shot was more challenging, a terrorist who was using a boulder for cover while directing the assault. Only his head and shoulders were visible through the scope, requiring precision that tested the limits of her shooting ability. She remembered Sully's instruction about breathing and trigger control, forcing herself to remain calm despite the chaos around her. The bullet found its mark, eliminating what appeared to be the assault team's tactical leader. The coordinated advance immediately became more disorganized as the remaining terrorists lost their primary coordinator. Sarah realized that her contribution was making a real difference in the battle's outcome, giving the SEALs crucial breathing room to reorganize their defense. Hayes received encouraging news from the shopping center, where federal agents had successfully neutralized the secondary terrorist team without casualties among the hostages. The immediate threat to civilian lives had been eliminated, but the attack on the range was still ongoing and remained dangerous for everyone in the command post. At 14:15 hours, the sound of approaching helicopters began to build in the distance. Military reinforcements were finally arriving, bringing additional firepower and tactical support. However, the remaining terrorists seemed determined to complete their mission before the reinforcements could intervene, intensifying their assault on the facility's defensive perimeter. Sarah continued engaging targets with Sully's rifle, each shot more confident than the last. The weapon's advanced systems compensated for many of the environmental factors that made precision shooting difficult, but success still required skill and courage under pressure. She was discovering capabilities she never knew she possessed. Sully had moved to a position where he could coordinate Sarah's fire while engaging close-range targets with his sidearm. His trust in her abilities was absolute, and his tactical guidance helped her make the most effective use of the precision rifle system. The partnership between the professional, warrior and civilian marksman was proving deadly to their attackers. The terrorist assault began to falter as their numbers decreased, and their coordination deteriorated. Sarah's precision fire had eliminated key leaders and weapons specialists, while the SEAL's defensive positions had prevented the attackers from reaching the main building. The terrorists were discovering that assaulting a position defended by Special Operations Forces was far more difficult than they had anticipated. Torres received confirmation that the helicopters carried a full tactical team with heavy weapons and close air support capability. The balance of power was about to shift dramatically in favor of the defenders. However, the remaining terrorists showed no signs of surrendering, suggesting they were prepared to fight to the death rather than be captured. Sarah's final shot of the engagement was the most important. Through the scope, she spotted a terrorist who had managed to reach the building's exterior and was placing what appeared to be a large explosive device against the wall. The range was too close for the advanced rifle's optimal performance, but missing wasn't an option. The explosion would likely collapse the building and kill everyone inside. She adjusted her aim point for the close range, controlled her breathing despite the adrenaline flooding her system, and fired. The terrorist collapsed just as he was connecting the detonation device, the explosive falling harmlessly to the ground. Sarah had prevented a catastrophe that would have ended the mission and potentially killed everyone in the command post. The approaching helicopters opened fire on the remaining terrorist positions, ending the assault with overwhelming firepower. The battle for the range was over, but the experience had transformed Sarah from a civilian business owner into someone who had played a crucial role in a national security operation. Her shooting range had become the site of 2 major engagements in a single day. As the dust settled and the immediate danger passed, Sully reclaimed his rifle with obvious pride in Sarah's performance. She had proven herself under the most challenging conditions possible, demonstrating that civilian skills could contribute meaningfully to military operations when circumstances demanded it. The trust he had placed in her had been completely justified. Sarah looked around at her shooting range, which bore the scars of battle, but had served its purpose in ways she never could have imagined. The routine Tuesday that had started with cleaning and maintenance had ended with her playing a vital role in preventing terrorist attacks and saving innocent lives. She would never look at her peaceful business the same way again. The mission was complete, but Sarah knew that her life had been permanently changed by the events of this extraordinary day. She had discovered courage and capabilities she never knew she possessed, and she had earned the respect of some of the military's most elite warriors. The shooting instructor had become something more, a guardian of innocent lives and a defender of her country's security.